The horrifying story of the young triplets who built a church for the dead, a historical documentary investigation. In the spring of 1947, a bush pilot named Thomas Garrett made an emergency landing on a gravel bar along the Koyukuk River, deep within the Alaska Triangle's interior. While waiting for weather to clear, he decided to explore the surrounding forest. 3 miles inland, he discovered something that would haunt Alaska's territorial records for decades: a small wooden church, meticulously constructed, with hand-carved pews facing an altar decorated with 127 human teeth arranged in careful geometric patterns. The church's logbook, protected in a tin box, recorded 3 years of services, sermons, hymns, and communion rites, all conducted and attended exclusively by the dead. The final entry, dated October 31, 1913, was written in 3 different hands, all belonging to children. "We have finished the work. They can rest now. We will join them for the final service tonight. Signed, Elijah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel Harrow, aged 11 years and 7 months." Wait before we proceed to the archives. If this enigma has already captured your curiosity, tell us where in the world you're joining this investigation from. To make sure you never miss another hidden truth or forgotten theory, subscribe and join our search. History has not yet revealed all of its secrets. Now, back to the facts. The discovery sent shockwaves through Alaska's small aviation community. Garrett, a decorated World War II veteran not given to flights of fancy, filed a detailed report with the Territorial Aviation Authority that included photographs, sketches, and a statement that would become famous in Alaska folklore circles. "I have seen many things that war and wilderness can do to men. I have never seen anything that suggested children could conceive of, much less construct, what I found in that clearing." The workmanship alone would challenge a trained carpenter. But the purpose, the terrible, focused purpose evident in every detail, that is something I cannot explain and do not wish to understand. The Alaska Territorial Police dispatched a 2-man investigation team to the site in June 1947. What they found confirmed Garrett's account and added layers of mystery that have never satisfactorily resolved. The church structure, measuring approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, was built from hand-hewn logs fitted with extraordinary precision. The floor was packed earth, smoothed and hardened. The pews, 6 on each side of a central aisle, showed evidence of careful sanding and finishing. Each pew had names carved into the backrest: Sarah Harrow, aged 34, Thomas Harrow, aged 36, Samuel Peterson, aged 42. 19 names in total, each with an age, each carved with the same careful attention to detail. The altar bore the teeth, arranged in a pattern that later analysis suggested might represent constellations, though which constellations and why remained unclear. Behind the altar, the wall was covered with elaborate carvings: human figures with wings, a sun with 7 faces, a tree growing downward from sky to earth, and hundreds of symbols that matched no known writing system, though they bore disturbing similarities to marks found at other sites throughout the Alaska Triangle, separated by decades and hundreds of miles. The logbook was the most troubling discovery. Bound in what appeared to be tanned leather, subsequent analysis proved it to be deer hide, it contained 156 dated entries spanning from July 15, 1910 to October 31, 1913. The entries described regular Sunday services, hymns sung, scripture read, communion administered. But the descriptions of the congregation were impossible. The 19 names carved in the pews appeared again and again in the logbook, described as present, participating, sometimes even speaking. Yet all 19 names belong to members of a prospecting party that had vanished in the region in the winter of 1909-1910, their fate unknown. The handwriting in the logbook shifted between three distinct styles, each labeled at the bottom of entries: Elijah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. The territorial police investigators, Officers Henry Wade and James McKinnon, spent 2 weeks at the site, excavating around the church, searching for graves, bodies, or any physical evidence that might explain the structure's purpose. They found 17 bodies, not 19, 17. Officer Wade's official report, filed July 3, 1947, describes the discovery. The remains were buried in a semicircle approximately 50 yards behind the church structure, each grave marked with a wooden cross bearing a name and date of death, all dated between November 1909 and February 1910. The graves were shallow, consistent with winter burial in frozen ground. The bodies showed evidence of death by exposure and starvation. Notably, we found no remains corresponding to the names Elijah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel Harrow, nor any remains of children at all. The whereabouts of the 3 boys who, according to the logbook, constructed the church and conducted services for 3 years remain unknown. The investigation's findings raised immediate questions. If the bodies were buried in 1909-1910 and the church was built and operated from 1910 to 1913, who built it? 3 11-year-old boys could not have accomplished such construction alone, particularly not in the remote Alaskan wilderness with winters that regularly dropped to 40 below zero. Where did they live during those 3 years? How did they survive? And most disturbing, what happened to them on October 31, 1913, when they wrote their final entry and apparently vanished? The territorial government, still reeling from the post-war period and struggling to manage a vast, sparsely populated region, did what governments often do with inexplicable mysteries. They filed the reports, sealed the evidence, and quietly discouraged further investigation. The church itself was left standing, too remote and too eerie to attract souvenir hunters or vandals. By 1950, the location had faded from official concern, becoming instead a legend whispered among bush pilots and trappers, the church where children preached to ghosts in a forest that held no living congregation. But the story of the Harrow triplets begins not in 1910, and not in Alaska. It begins in 1899, in the coal mining regions of eastern Kentucky, where 3 boys were born to Margaret and Nathaniel Harrow on the same March morning, arriving during a spring snowstorm that local midwives later described as unnatural. Snow that fell upward as often as down, as if the sky itself was confused about which way was earth and which was heaven. Margaret Harrow kept a diary, portions of which survived and were later donated to the Kentucky Historical Society. Her entries about her sons are sparse but revealing. From April 1899. The boys are identical in appearance but singular in nature. Elijah speaks rarely but watches everything. Isaiah talks constantly, narrating the world around him as if afraid silence might erase it. Ezekiel neither speaks nor watches, but hums, wordless melodies that seem to come from nowhere, songs I do not recognize and cannot remember once he stops. From November 1901. The boys are now 2 years old and have begun to move as one entity, not following each other but moving simultaneously, as if governed by a single impulse distributed across 3 bodies. Yesterday, while I prepared supper, all 3 reached for the same toy at the same instant, their hands meeting in the air. They looked at each other and laughed, and the sound was perfectly synchronized, 3 voices creating one laugh. I found it beautiful and terrible in equal measure. From June 1903. Nathaniel is disturbed by the boys' games. They play church, he says, though we have never taken them to services. The mine operates 7 days, and we have no time for such things. Yet they arrange their few toys in rows, stand one at the front, and the other 2 recite what sound like prayers. When Nathanael demanded to know where they learned such things, Elijah said, "The people who aren't here anymore taught us. They want to be remembered." Nathanael struck him for lying. The boy did not cry, but his brothers did, in perfect unison, though neither had been touched. Nathaniel Harrow worked in the Patterson Creek mine, one of dozens of coal operations that scarred the Kentucky mountains in the early 20th century. Mine work was brutal, dangerous, and often brief. Men descended into darkness at dawn and, if they emerged, at dusk, their lungs slowly filling with coal dust, their bodies gradually breaking under the weight of stone and labor. On August 12, 1907, the Patterson Creek mine experienced a methane explosion. 43 men were working the deep shaft when the gas ignited. 37 died immediately. 6 survived long enough to be brought to the surface, where they died over the following hours and days, their lungs seared by heat and toxic fumes. Nathaniel Harrow was one of the 6. He lived for 3 days, conscious and articulate until the final hours. Margaret's diary entry from August 15, 1907, the day of her husband's death, is longer than any other entry in the surviving volume. Nathaniel died this morning. Before he lost the power of speech, he told me things I wish I could unknow. He said that in the darkness after the explosion, as the survivors waited for rescue, the dead miners began to speak. Not with voices, their bodies were too broken for that, but directly into the minds of the living. They were not angry, Nathaniel said. They were confused. They did not understand that they were dead. They thought they were still working, still chipping coal from the seam, still counting the hours until they could go home to their families. They asked the survivors to tell their wives they would be late for supper. They asked about their children. They made plans for Sunday. Nathaniel said the worst part was not hearing the dead speak, but realizing they would continue speaking forever, trapped in their final moments, unaware that their bodies were cooling in the dark while their minds repeated the same thoughts, the same concerns, the same small hopes that had occupied them in the instant before death. He said, someone needs to help them understand. Someone needs to lay them to rest properly, not just their bodies, but their minds, their last thoughts. Otherwise, they'll be trapped there forever, in that moment, confused and waiting. I do not know if these were the words of a dying man's delirium or something true and terrible, but the boys heard everything. They were in the room. They stood at the foot of their father's bed, holding hands, and when Nathaniel finished speaking, Ezekiel began to hum a melody that sounded like a funeral hymn, though he has never attended a funeral. And Elijah said very quietly, "We understand. We will help them." After Nathaniel's death, Margaret struggled to support herself and her 3 sons. The mine company provided a small death benefit, $40, calculated at approximately $1 per dead miner, but it was inadequate for long-term survival. Margaret took in laundry, worked as a domestic servant, and gradually fell into debt to the company's store, a debt that would eventually own her life and determine her fate. Her diary entries from late 1907 and early 1908 describe increasing worry about her son's behavior. The boys no longer play as children should. They spend hours arranging stones in patterns, sitting in absolute silence, then suddenly speaking in unison, the same words, the same inflection, as if they are 3 mouths connected to one mind. Yesterday I found them in the shed, carving symbols into pieces of wood with Nathaniel's old knife. When I asked what the symbols meant, Isaiah said, "They're names, the names of the ones who don't know they're gone. When you write a name down, it helps the person remember they existed. If they remember they existed, they can remember they stopped." I do not know how to mother children who speak of such things. I do not know if I am raising boys or something else, something that wears the shape of boys but contains knowledge that should not fit inside 11-year-old minds. In the spring of 1909, Margaret made a decision that would determine the course of her sons' lives and deaths. She had heard stories of the Alaska gold rush. The Klondike boom had passed, but new strikes were reported throughout interior Alaska, and rumors of opportunity drew desperate people north. The mine company debt had grown to $156, an impossible sum. The company could take her house, her possessions, even her children as labor to work off the debt. Child labor was common in the coal fields. Alaska represented escape, a blank space on the map where debts could not follow, where 3 strange boys might be overlooked in a land full of strange people doing strange things for stranger reasons. Margaret sold everything she owned, purchased steamer tickets from Seattle to Nome, and in June 1909 departed Kentucky with her 3 sons. She was 34 years old. The boys were 10. The journey from Kentucky to Alaska took 5 weeks. Margaret kept no diary during this period. Perhaps the chaos of travel prevented it, or perhaps she had nothing to say that could be captured in words. The family arrived in Nome in late July 1909, at the tail end of the summer season when the brief Arctic summer was already turning toward autumn's rapid descent into winter. Nome in 1909 was a town in decline. The Great Gold Rush had peaked in 1900, and by 1909 the easy placer gold had been exhausted. The population, which had swelled to 20,000 at the boom's height, had collapsed to fewer than 3,000. The town was a study in abandonment. Empty buildings, rusting equipment, and the hollow-eyed stare of people who had bet everything on fortune and lost. Margaret found work cooking at a boarding house run by a Norwegian woman named Ingrid Sorensen. Sorensen's pay, which was minimal, but included a small room for herself and the boys. Sorensen's diary, preserved in the Carrie McLean Memorial Museum in Nome, provides the only contemporary account of the Harrows during their brief time in Nome. From August 15, 1909. The new cook is competent, which is more than I expected given her circumstances. A widow with 3 boys, all identical, all unsettling. They are too quiet, too watchful. They sit in the corner of the kitchen while their mother works, and they observe the boarders with an intensity that makes grown men uncomfortable. Several miners have complained. One said, "The boys look at him like they're measuring me for a coffin." I told him he drinks too much and sees phantoms, but I understand what he means. There is something in those boys' eyes that does not belong in children. From September 3, 1909. The boys have begun making small crosses from scrap wood. They leave them in odd places, on the threshold, beside the wash basin, tucked into the seams of the wallpaper. When I asked them why, the one called Isaiah said, "There are people here who forgot to leave. The crosses help them remember the door. I do not allow superstitious nonsense in my establishment. I made them collect every cross and burn them in the stove." They obeyed without argument, but that night I heard them singing, if it can be called singing. A 3-part harmony that sounded like church music filtered through water, distorted but still recognizable as something meant for worship or mourning or both. I did not sleep well. In late September 1909, Margaret met Thomas Peterson, a Swedish prospector who had been working claims in the interior near the Koyukuk River. Peterson was organizing a small expedition to return to his claims before the winter freeze, and he was looking for a cook willing to winter in the bush in exchange for a share of any gold found. It was a desperate offer for desperate people. Margaret accepted. Ingrid Sorensen's final diary entry concerning the Harrows is dated September 28, 1909. Margaret and her boys departed today with Peterson's party. 17 people in total, heading into the interior just as winter approaches. I tried to dissuade her. I told her that women and children do not belong in winter camps, that the darkness and isolation break strong men and will certainly destroy those already fragile. She said she had no choice. The boarding house work pays enough for survival, but not for escape. And escape is what she needs. Escape from what? I asked. She did not answer, but one of the boys, Elijah, I think, said, "She means escape from us. But you can't escape us, Mother. We're what you made when you brought us here. This is the right place for what we need to do." Margaret went pale when he said this. I think she is afraid of her own children. I think she is right to be afraid. The Peterson expedition departed Nome on October 1, 1909, traveling by riverboat up the Yukon and then overland to the Koyukuk drainage. Contemporary accounts suggest they reached their destination, a series of claims along a tributary stream, in late October, just as the first serious snows began. We have no direct records of what happened that winter. What we know is reconstructed from physical evidence discovered in 1947, from fragmentary reports by indigenous Koyukon Athabascan people who traveled through the region, and from the logbook found in the church, though how much of the logbook should be considered reliable documentation versus the product of traumatized or disturbed minds is a question that has never satisfactorily answered. The winter of 1909 to 1910 was severe even by interior Alaska standards. Temperature records from Fort Yukon, the nearest weather station, show sustained periods of -50 degrees Fahrenheit to -60 degrees Fahrenheit, with little relief between November and March. In such conditions, survival requires continuous effort, maintaining fire, preventing frostbite, securing adequate food, and protecting mental health against the crushing weight of darkness and isolation. Something went wrong at the Peterson camp. We know this because in July 1910, a Koyukon hunter named Paul Williams reported to the U.S. Marshal in Fairbanks that he had discovered an abandoned camp along the Koyukuk tributary with evidence of multiple graves. The Marshal's office noted the report but took no action. Deaths in remote camps were common enough that investigation was rarely practical unless there was evidence of violence or crime. Williams provided more detail in a 1932 interview conducted by anthropologist Frederica de Laguna as part of her research into Koyukon oral traditions. By then, Williams was an old man, and his memories of the camp had taken on the quality of folklore. But certain details remained consistent with physical evidence discovered in 1947. I came on the camp in summer, when the snow was gone and the ground was soft. There were graves, many graves, marked with crosses. A shelter collapsed from winter snow, equipment scattered and rusting, and a new structure being built. A building with straight walls and a peaked roof, not like the rough shelters miners usually throw up. 3 boys were working on it. Young boys, maybe 10 or 11 years old, identical in appearance. They were cutting logs, fitting them, working with tools too large for their hands, but working well, with skill beyond their years. I asked them where the adults were. They said the adults were resting. I asked if they were alone. They said no, they had plenty of company. Everyone who had wintered in the camp was still there. They just needed a proper place to gather. I thought they meant graves. I thought they meant the dead were buried there and the boys were maintaining some kind of memorial. But one of the boys, the one who seemed to be the leader, though they all looked exactly the same, he said, "They're not buried here. They're still here. They don't know how to leave. They keep trying to do the things they did before, but they can't hold the tools anymore, can't feel the cold anymore, can't eat the food anymore. They're very confused. We're building them a church so they can learn to rest properly." I did not like this. I did not like these boys alone in the wilderness, talking about the dead as if they were still present. I offered to take them back to the river, back to safety. They refused. They said our work was not finished. They said, "Our mother is here. She needs us to finish. They all need us to finish. Then we can all rest together." I left them there. I reported what I'd found, and I did not go back to that place. Some places are wrong. Not dangerous in the way a bear is dangerous or a river is dangerous. Wrong in a deeper way, in a way that makes you feel like the world is not shaped the way you thought it was. For 3 years, from 1910 to 1913, the Harrow triplets lived alone in the Alaska wilderness, constructing and maintaining their church for the dead. The logbook found in 1947 documents this period in disturbing detail. The entries begin with a dedication, written in all 3 hands simultaneously. The handwriting shifts between the 3 styles within single words, as if the boys took turns writing individual letters. We, Elijah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel Harrow, do establish this church in the name of all those who are lost between living and dying, who do not know they have finished, who wait in confusion for a release that will not come unless someone shows them the way. Our Father taught us, in His dying, that the dead can be trapped in their last thoughts if those thoughts are interrupted suddenly and violently. The mine explosion took the miners before they could finish their last ideas. They are still trying to finish them. Our mother and the 17 others who wintered here were taken by cold and hunger before they understood what was happening. They are still trying to understand. We will help them finish. We will help them understand. We will conduct services until they learn to rest. The first regular entry is dated July 15, 1910. Today, we held our first service. Attendance, 19 souls, including our mother. We sang hymn number 127 from the Methodist hymnal. We only have the one hymnal, saved from Mother's possessions. We read from Genesis, the story of creation, because we thought they should remember how things begin if they are going to understand how things end. Ezekiel delivered the sermon. He spoke about rest, about how it is not the same as emptiness, about how continuing when you are finished is a kind of suffering. The congregation listened. We could feel them listening. After the service, Mother approached us. She tried to speak, but could not. She has not learned how to speak in her current state, but she touched our faces, or tried to. We felt her intention, even though we could not feel her hands. She is learning. They are all learning. Subsequent entries follow a similar pattern. Dates, attendance figures, always 19, hymns sung, scripture read, sermons delivered. The boys rotated roles. Each took turns preaching, leading songs, administering communion, with elements that consisted of nothing physical, but which the boys insisted were received by the congregation. The tone of the entries is matter-of-fact, almost bureaucratic, as if documenting the routine operations of an ordinary church rather than something impossible. From October 3, 1910, attendance excellent despite heavy snow. We have noticed that the congregation appears more solid during services than at other times. During the week, they are difficult to perceive. Shadows, cold spots, the sense of presence without form. But during services, especially during hymns, they become almost visible, not as they were in life, but as shapes that suggest human form. Mr. Peterson sat in his usual pew and seemed to mouth the words to "Nearer, my God, to thee." Progress is being made. From January 17, 1911, winter darkness is complete now. We hold services by lamplight, though we suspect the congregation does not need light to see, or perhaps they see in a way that makes light irrelevant. Isaiah preached today on the subject of memory. He spoke about how identity is built from memories, how we know ourselves by remembering ourselves, and how death might be understood as the final memory, the last moment of knowing who you are before you become something else or nothing else. If the final memory is interrupted, if you die still thinking you are living, the memory never completes. You remain trapped in the incomplete thought of yourself. The congregation seemed agitated during this sermon. We could feel their recognition, their understanding beginning. Sarah Thompson wept. We could not see tears, but we felt weeping, the emotional fact of it without the physical expression. From April 9th, 1911, first true spring day, the sun stayed visible for nearly 12 hours. We opened the church doors to let in the warmth. Several members of the congregation attempted to leave, not to depart permanently, but to step outside as one might step out of a building on a beautiful day. They could not. They cannot pass the threshold. They are bound to this place, and we begin to understand why. They died here in confusion and cold, and some essential part of them remains anchored to the moment and place of death. The church gives them form and purpose, but it does not free them. We are beginning to realize that our work requires a final step, something we have been avoiding because we understand what it means. We must show them how to complete their dying. We must finish what the cold and darkness interrupted. The entries from 1912 show the boys grappling with this realization. The tone shifts from documentation to theology, from record-keeping to philosophy. The boys were now 12 years old, living alone in the wilderness for nearly 2 years, conducting services for the dead, and developing an increasingly sophisticated understanding of what they had undertaken. From June 22, 1912, Elijah preached today on the nature of sacrifice. He argued that every act of helping requires the helper to pay a cost. The cost might be time, effort, resources, or attention. But sometimes the cost is higher. Sometimes the cost is the self. Sometimes helping someone else complete their journey requires joining them on that journey, walking with them into the darkness, showing them the way by going first or going together. We have been avoiding this understanding, but it becomes clearer each week. The congregation cannot learn to rest by being told about rest. They must be shown. They must see someone cross the boundary between confusion and completion, between trapped and released. They must witness a death that finishes properly, that reaches its natural conclusion without interruption. And we are the only living people here to provide that witness. From September 15, 1912, we have been preparing for the final service. We understand now that this has always been the purpose of our work, not to maintain a church forever, but to prepare for a single conclusive ceremony that will release the congregation into whatever comes after confusion. We must die properly, in the church, during a service, in a way that demonstrates how dying concludes rather than interrupts. Our deaths must be a teaching, a final sermon delivered not in words but in the act itself. We are not afraid. We have been living with the dead for so long that the boundary between living and dead has become less distinct. We understand that what we call life is just one state of being, and what we call death is another, and neither is an ending, just a transformation. But the transformation must be completed. Our congregation has been trapped mid-transformation for 3 years. We will show them how to finish. The final year of entries from late 1912 through October 1913 document the boys' preparations for what they called the final service. They spent months carving symbols into every surface of the church: the walls, the floor, the altar, the undersides of pews. They collected teeth from the 19 graves, the bodies having been dead long enough that the teeth could be recovered without disturbing flesh, and arranged them in patterns behind the altar. They wrote increasingly complex theological treatises attempting to explain the mechanics of death and consciousness, ideas far beyond what 11- and 12-year-old children should be capable of conceiving, let alone articulating. From March 3, 1913, Isaiah has finished the final sermon. It will not be spoken aloud, but written on our bodies in symbols the congregation can read. We have been practicing the symbols, cutting them lightly into our skin so we know where each mark must go when the time comes. The symbols are a language that exists between words and ideas, a language that the dead understand better than the living, because the dead are no longer constrained by the need for sound and sequence. The symbols will say, "This is how you finish. Watch us finish. Then you can finish too." Then we all become what we were always becoming. From July 30th, 1913, we have chosen the date, October 31st, the day when the boundary between living and dead is thinnest, according to the old traditions Mother used to mention, the day when transitions are easiest. We will hold a final service. We will invite the congregation to witness, and we will cross over together, all 22 of us, 19 who have been waiting and 3 who will show the way. After that, the church will stand empty, but it will have served its purpose. The dead will be released, and we will rest with them. From October 15th, 1913, 2 weeks remain. We are ready. We have written instructions for anyone who finds this place, explaining what we have done and why. We hope they will understand that we were not mad, not self-destructive, but simply obedient to a calling we did not choose but could not refuse. Our mother asked us to help her. Our father, in his dying, showed us that the dead can be trapped. We have given 3 years of our lives to this work, and now we will give the remainder to complete it. This is not tragedy. This is service. This is love in its most pure and terrible form. The willingness to join those you love in their suffering, to walk with them through darkness, to teach by example even when the lesson costs everything. The final entry is dated October 31st, 1913, written in all 3 hands. We have finished the work. They can rest now. We will join them for the final service tonight. Signed, Elijah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel Harrow, aged 11 years and 7 months. Below this, in smaller writing, if you are reading this, you have found our church. Do not be afraid of it. Do not burn it or tear it down. It is sacred space, consecrated by suffering and released by sacrifice. Let it stand. Let it weather into the earth. Let it return to the forest slowly, naturally, as all things should return. The dead are gone from here now, not destroyed, but released. We succeeded. Tell anyone who asks, 3 children loved their mother enough to follow her into darkness, and in doing so, they brought light to 19 souls who were lost. That is not horror. That is grace. When the territorial police investigators excavated the area around the church in 1947, they found the 17 graves exactly as described in the logbook. They found no remains of Margaret Harrow or Thomas Peterson, 2 of the 19 names, though crosses marked their burial sites. Most troubling, they found no remains of the 3 boys themselves. Officer Wade's report notes, "We expanded our search in concentric circles from the church, covering approximately 2 square miles. We found no graves, no bodies, no evidence of the 3 boys beyond the logbook and the structure itself. The final entry suggests they intended to die in the church on October 31st, 1913. If they did so, their bodies were removed by someone. But who? And why would someone remove children's bodies while leaving the 17 adult bodies undisturbed? Alternatively, the boys did not die as they planned, but left the area for reasons unknown. But this raises its own questions. Why leave the logbook behind? Why construct such an elaborate narrative of sacrifice if they ultimately chose to live? The investigation concluded with more questions than answers. The official finding was inconclusive. 17 deaths by exposure and starvation, winter 1909-10. Three children of unknown fate. Last documented October 31, 1913. Church structure of unknown purpose, constructed by unknown persons. Recommend site be left undisturbed and marked for future investigation if resources permit. No future investigation was conducted. The site was too remote, the mystery too strange, the practical value of answers too limited to justify the expense. The church was left standing, and for decades it stood alone in the forest, gradually weathering, slowly being reclaimed by moss and time. But the story did not end with the 1947 investigation. Over the following decades, reports began to accumulate of strange experiences at the site. Bush pilots who landed near the church reported hearing singing, three-part harmony, children's voices, hymns that seemed to come from nowhere. Trappers who camped in the vicinity reported dreams of church services, attended by empty pews, that nonetheless felt full. Of sermons preached by voices that spoke directly into the dreamer's mind without using sound. In 1963, a geological survey team spent 3 days working in the area. Their field notes, preserved in the USGS archives, include several odd observations. Team members report persistent feeling of being observed, though no other humans present in area. Multiple reports of hearing children's laughter from the forest, always from a direction opposite the church. Acoustic properties unusual. Sounds carry strangely. Voices seem to come from inside one's own head rather than from external source. Recommend future teams avoid camping within 1 mile of the structure marked on maps as Harrow Church. In 1978, a documentary filmmaker named Robert Chen obtained permits to visit and film the site. His resulting film, The Church of Lost Children, aired once on Alaska Public Television and then was pulled from circulation at Chen's request. In a 1982 interview, Chen explained why. What we captured on film was disturbing enough. A structure that shouldn't exist, built by children who shouldn't have been capable of such work, filled with symbols that shouldn't form coherent patterns, but somehow do. But what disturbed me more was what happened to our crew during filming. We spent 2 days at the site. During that time, all 4 crew members, including myself, experienced the same sequence of dreams. We did not discuss these dreams until after we left the site, but when we finally shared our experiences, we realized we had dreamed the same events. We dreamed we were attending a church service. The church was full, every pew occupied, but the congregation was transparent, barely visible. 3 boys stood at the altar, identical in appearance, wearing clothes from the early 1900s. They were conducting a service, but the words were not English. They were some other language, or perhaps not language at all, but pure meaning transmitted directly into our minds. The service was about completion, about finishing, about how to let go of the last thought that keeps you attached to a moment that has already passed. And at the end of the service, the boys, they didn't disappear exactly. They became transparent, like the congregation. They faded into the same state of near visibility. And then the entire church, congregation, and builders together simply ceased. Not violently, not dramatically. They just finished. And in finishing, they were gone. All 4 of us had the same dream, the same sequence of events, the same visual details, the same transmitted understanding of what the service was about. You can't explain that as coincidence. You can't explain it as suggestion or expectation. We didn't know each other well enough to have developed shared symbolic languages, but we experienced the same thing. And when we reviewed our footage later, there were 3 frames. Just 3 frames out of thousands where the church appears occupied. Just for a fraction of a second, you can see shapes in the pews, shapes that suggest human forms without being definitively human. And at the altar, 3 small figures that might be children, or might be shadows, or might be something our cameras caught that human eyes are not designed to see. Chen never released the footage. When asked if it still exists, he says only, "I destroyed it. Not because I'm afraid of ridicule, but because I'm afraid someone might try to study it scientifically, might try to analyze those 3 frames, might try to understand what the cameras captured. I think some things should remain unseen." The boys built that church to help the dead rest. They succeeded, but they paid a terrible price, the price of joining the dead in order to teach them. Their work is done. Their sacrifice is complete. Digging it up, analyzing it, trying to explain it with modern tools, that feels like disturbing a grave. I won't do it. The academic response to the Harrow case has been limited and largely skeptical. The few researchers who have examined the evidence, the logbook, the photographs of the church, the official reports, generally fall into 2 camps. Those who believe the entire thing is an elaborate hoax, and those who believe the boys existed but were severely mentally disturbed, creating an elaborate delusional system that happened to leave physical evidence behind. Dr. Patricia Thornton, a child psychologist who reviewed the case materials in 1995, argued, "The sophistication of the theological ideas in the logbook is inconsistent with children of that age. Either the logbook was written by adults pretending to be children, or the boys were coached by an adult, perhaps their mother before her death, or perhaps a surviving adult from the camp who the historical record missed." The idea that 3 11-year-old children could independently develop complex theories about consciousness, death, and the trapped nature of interrupted identity, it's not developmentally plausible. But Dr. Thornton's analysis struggles with several facts. First, the handwriting analysis conducted by the FBI at the request of the Alaska State Police in 1987 confirmed that the logbook was written by 3 different individuals, all with motor control consistent with children aged 10-13. Second, the church structure itself required skill and sustained labor beyond what most adults could accomplish alone, let alone children. Third, the consistency of reports from independent witnesses over decades, the singing, the dreams, the sense of presence, suggests something more than hoax or delusion. Dr. Michael Forrester, an anthropologist specializing in death rituals, offered a different interpretation in a 2004 paper. What if we take the boys at their word? What if we accept that they believed, genuinely, completely believed, that they could see and communicate with the dead members of the camp? Children who experience severe trauma often develop what psychologists call magical thinking as a coping mechanism. The Harrow triplets witnessed their father's painful death, heard him describe the trapped consciousness of dead miners, watched their mother die of starvation in an Alaska winter, and found themselves utterly alone in the wilderness at age 10. Under those conditions, developing an elaborate belief system in which they could still communicate with their mother, could still serve and help her, could give meaning to their survival when 19 others died, that's not insanity. That's adaptation. The church becomes their therapy, their coping mechanism made physical. The rituals give structure to chaos. The sermons are ways of processing grief. The 3-year timeline reflects the natural progression of grief work: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. The final service, the decision to join the congregation, that might represent not literal suicide, but symbolic death of the traumatized selves they had become. A decision to release their trauma and move forward. The fact that their bodies were never found suggests they survived, left the area, and eventually integrated into society under different names. The logbook's final entry is metaphorical, not literal. It's an elegant theory, and it accounts for many of the facts. But it doesn't explain the teeth arranged on the altar, the elaborate carvings that match symbols found at other sites throughout the Alaska Triangle, the consistency of supernatural experiences reported by independent witnesses decades apart, or the 3 frames of Chen's film showing figures in empty pews. The Koyukon Athabascan perspective offers yet another interpretation, though one rarely included in academic analyses. In 2008, Elder Paul Williams II, grandson of the Paul Williams who discovered the church under construction in 1910, agreed to an interview with researchers from the Alaska Native Knowledge Network. "My grandfather told me this story many times," Williams said. "He believed those boys were not ordinary children. He believed they were born with what we call keltal, the ability to see and walk in both worlds, the world of the living and the world of the dead. Some people are born with thin boundaries between the worlds. They can see what others can't see, hear what others can't hear. Usually, this ability causes suffering. The person becomes confused, unable to distinguish which world they belong to. But sometimes, rarely, a person with keltal learns to use it purposefully, to help others who are stuck between the worlds. My grandfather said the camp where all those people died, that place became what we call yuhul, a hungry place." When many people die violently or suddenly in the same location, especially if they die in confusion or fear, their confusion can soak into the land itself. The place becomes saturated with unfinished dying. And that saturation attracts certain kinds of spirits, or creates them, or both. A yugul is dangerous because it pulls at living people, tries to make them join the confused dead, tries to increase the confusion. Those three boys, they had the ability to see the confusion, and they chose to try to heal it. That's a rare thing. Most people with keltal just suffer from what they see. But those boys, they decided to serve what they saw. They built a structure that could contain the confusion, channel it, give it form and direction. And when they had done all they could from the living side, they made the choice to cross over and finish the work from the dead side. That's what my grandfather believed. He said when he met those boys in 1910, he could see they were already half in the other world. They were already changing. By 1913, they probably didn't belong fully to either world anymore. So the crossing would have been easy, natural, like walking from one room into another room in a house you already know. When asked what happened to the boys after October 31st, 1913, Williams said, "I think they did exactly what they said they would do. I think they finished the work, and I think they're still there, in some way, not as ghosts. Ghosts are infused, trapped. They're there as something else, as keepers maybe, as guardians of a boundary that they know how to maintain, because they learned to cross it. The church is empty now because the work is done. The confused dead are released, but the boys remain, making sure that place doesn't become yugul again, making sure the balance they created is maintained." This interpretation is, of course, impossible to prove or disprove by conventional means. But it is consistent with both the physical evidence and the reported experiences of people who have visited the site. It also aligns with a broader pattern throughout the Alaska Triangle of places where the boundary between normal and anomalous seems unusually permeable, where consciousness and environment interact in ways that defy materialist explanation. The church still stands, though it is increasingly difficult to reach. Climate change has altered the river patterns that provide access to the area, and the Alaska wilderness has a way of reclaiming what humans briefly occupied. The last confirmed visit to the site was in 2011 by a team of researchers from the University of Alaska Museum. Their report describes a structure in advanced decay, walls leaning, roof partially collapsed, floor overtaken by moss and small plants. The carved symbols remain visible, but weathered. The pews are still in place, though some have rotted through. The altar stands empty. The teeth were removed by investigators in 1947 and lost in subsequent decades of bureaucratic custody transfers. The research team spent 6 hours documenting the site and left before nightfall. When asked if they experienced anything unusual, team leader Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to filmmaker Robert Chen, said only, "We heard singing. All four of us heard it, so it wasn't individual auditory hallucination. Children's voices, three-part harmony, coming from inside the church. We recorded 6 hours of audio at the site. When we reviewed the recordings later, there was no singing on the tape. But we all heard it. We all heard the same melody. It was beautiful. Sad, but beautiful. Like a lullaby for something that needs to sleep, but hasn't learned how yet. The logbook remains in the Alaska State Archives, available to researchers, but rarely requested. It has been digitized, though archivists report that the digital images somehow fail to capture certain details visible in the original, particularly the later entries where the handwriting shifts between 3 styles within single words, creating a visual effect that suggests simultaneity rather than sequence. Attempts to decode the symbols carved throughout the church have been unsuccessful. Linguists, cryptographers, and anthropologists have examined photographs and rubbings, searching for patterns that might reveal language or meaning. Some researchers claim to see astronomical data encoded in the arrangements. Others see musical notation. Still others see random marks that the pattern-seeking human mind forces into seeming significance. But several researchers have noted a curious effect. Staring at the symbols for extended periods induces a trance-like state characterized by vivid mental imagery of church services, of children preaching to empty pews that feel full, of boundaries dissolving between observer and observed, between living and dead, between self and other. The effect is consistent enough that the archived photographs of the symbols now carry a warning label. Extended viewing may cause disorientation. Limit exposure to 30 minutes per session. But in the end, we are left with a story that resists easy conclusions. 3 identical boys born in Kentucky coal country traveled with their widowed mother to Alaska in search of escape from debt and tragedy. They wintered in a remote camp where 19 people, including their mother, died of cold and starvation. The boys survived. And rather than hiking out to safety, rather than seeking rescue, they spent 3 years alone in the wilderness constructing an elaborate church and conducting weekly services for the dead. The logbook they left behind describes this work in detail, work that seems impossible for children of their age, motivated by theology that seems far beyond their capacity to develop. The final entry suggests they intended to die in a ritualized ceremony meant to teach the dead how to complete their dying. Their bodies have never been found. Multiple independent witnesses over 70 years have reported similar supernatural experiences at the site: singing, dreams of church services, feelings of presence, and the sense that something significant happened there. Something that changed the nature of the place in ways that persist long after the events themselves. We can dismiss this as folklore built around a tragic case of child death and adult projection. We can explain it as trauma-induced delusion creating lasting psychological effects on a location through cultural transmission and expectation. Or we can consider the possibility that the boys succeeded in what they attempted, that they learned to perceive and interact with something most people cannot perceive, that they conducted a 3-year ritual designed to release trapped consciousness, and that they paid for this service with their own lives, or with their own transformation into something that exists between categories we have words for. The evidence supports all 3 interpretations to varying degrees. The choice of which to accept says more about the chooser than about the evidence itself. Do we prioritize materialist explanations even when they require dismissing consistent testimony and physical evidence? Do we accept that consciousness might be stranger and more persistent than we typically assume? Do we allow for the possibility that children, unencumbered by adult skepticism, might perceive realities that adults have learned to ignore? What we can say with certainty is this: 3 boys named Elijah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel Harrow existed. They traveled to Alaska in 1909. They survived a winter that killed 19 others. They built a church in the wilderness, alone at age 10 or 11. They left behind a detailed account of 3 years spent in service to something they believed to be real and important. They vanished on or after October 31st, 1913, leaving no trace but their work. The church stands, barely, in a forest north of the Koyukuk River. It is rotting slowly, returning to the earth, becoming part of the landscape it briefly distinguished itself from. In another 20 years, it will likely be indistinguishable from the natural fallen timber of the forest floor. The story will outlast the structure, as stories often do. But what will the story be? A tragedy of child death in the wilderness? A psychological case study in trauma and delusion? A supernatural account of children who could see and speak with the dead? A cultural teaching about the nature of grief and the work of letting go? A mystery that resists all attempts at comfortable resolution? Perhaps all of these simultaneously. Perhaps the story refuses singular meaning because the events themselves existed in multiple registers at once: physical and psychological, material and spiritual, tragic and sacred, horrifying and beautiful. The Harrow triplets built a church for the dead in a forest where the dead could not rest. Whether the dead were literal ghosts or metaphors for the boys' own trauma, the church served its purpose. Something was released. Something was completed. Something that had been trapped, whether in the land, in the boys' minds, or in a liminal space where both are true, was finally allowed to finish its dying. And 3 children, born during a snowstorm that fell both up and down, disappeared into that finishing, leaving behind only symbols we cannot read, services we can still sometimes hear, and the question of whether horror and grace might sometimes be the same thing viewed from different angles of desperate human love. The Alaska Triangle has swallowed 16,000 people. Most left no trace. But the Harrow triplets left a church, a logbook, and a teaching carved in symbols and silence. That dying must be completed, that the trapped must be released, and that sometimes the only way to teach completion is to demonstrate it, even when, especially when, the demonstration costs everything.